Hi, my name is Ali, and last year I self-deported from the US for the second time in my life, the first time being when I was a child as part of an undocumented family. I made the zine, wrote and illustrated it, called Second Chance Immigrant, about my experience immigrating to the US 2 times and being forced to self-deport each time. If you want to read it, the zine is available to read for free as a PDF on my website. If you want to get a physical copy, I'm working on distributing those throughout the year. In the next few months, you should be able to find it in bookstores, zine distros, zine festivals, and libraries in Minneapolis, New Mexico, Chicago, New York, California, Kansas City, places like that. If you'd also like to help distribute physical copies, please let me know. I will not be profiting off this now or ever. They will be giving it out either for free with the encouragement to donate to local grassroots efforts who are fighting for immigrants' rights and fighting against ICE in the US. And if there is a price on any physical copy you find, profits will go directly to those donations. Again, I'm not profiting off this. My main goal for distributing it, for releasing it, for telling the story is to spread awareness about the plights of modern immigrants in the US and encourage people to donate and contribute to and volunteer at the groups who are trying to fight this injustice. All that aside, this video is so that I can tell my story in a different way as well. You can read the zine, you can watch this video. I'm just going to talk a little bit about my story, about what happened to me, about my immigration experience in the US, as I've alluded to it many times, and I feel like I've never actually fully explained it online at any point. This scene pretty much explains everything, but I might as well make a video about it too. And the first thing I want to say right off the bat is that this is not a sob story. When I'm telling you my story, it's not a tragic story. It is certainly something horrific I've gone through, something traumatic I've gone through that has affected me throughout my life. But my story, I think, is not tragic because it does not end in tragedy. It actually ends with a happy ending. And the reason I want to point that out first and foremost is because, one, I think it's very important to acknowledge your privilege, and two, I think it's very important for anyone hearing this story to acknowledge and recognize that my ending is not the usual ending or the common ending. I live a very privileged life now. I was lucky, I got out, and I'm living a very stable life right now. And for many people, most people even, that is not the reality. Most people who are undocumented immigrants, who are immigrants in the US right now under the Trump administration. Even so, I do want to share my story because I feel like there's something to learn from it. It's something I want to share about myself. So I'll just get started, I guess. So I was born in 1999 in Anzoátegui, Venezuela, to Venezuelan parents, Venezuelan-born family, Venezuelan all the way down. And when I was about a year old, my family moved, me, my siblings, and my parents, to suburban Tennessee. We immigrated there on a visa that no longer exists, where my parents could start a business and try to employ Americans as well. This was around 2000, close to 2001, and we all know what happened in 2001 in the US, so it was not great timing for the economy, for the sentiment towards immigrants. And ultimately, what happened was that we were, I love that I say we, as of, again, I'm like 2 years old at this point. I'm not conscious at the time, but my parents were not able to renew the visa. And so I lived the rest of my childhood, or the next few years of my childhood, as an undocumented child, as part of an undocumented family in the US. Just to give you a little context of what that looks like, my parents didn't speak much English. Well, one of them more than the other, but they didn't speak much English when I was in the US. But I was growing up basically as an Americanized child. I didn't speak much Spanish, honestly, which is, if you know anything about immigrant families, it's a very common experience of like the parents speaking their native language to the child, but the child speaking like the local language back. And like there's sort of being a weird communication barrier there, but like it still works. Sorry, I had to adjust the camera. Yeah, I was a super Americanized child. I didn't know much Spanish. I didn't even process Venezuela as a real place. It was just like where my parents come from, where I was technically born, and it was just like a fun fact that I could drop about like the world records of it and whatnot, and the arepas and whatnot. And at the same time, I was a bit ashamed of it, but it was, if anything, it wasn't a real part of me. It wasn't a place I even processed as real. And I think deep down, I just felt like any other American child in suburban Tennessee. And all that made it a lot worse when at 10 years old, after we've been living in the US for almost a decade, we had to self-deport back to Venezuela. You may be wondering why we waited so long, since we became undocumented pretty soon after arriving. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the Dream Care Act, the DACA bill. And I just feel like when that came out, a lot of people were like clueless and were like, oh, this came out of nowhere. But this bill was actually trying to be passed for a long time, for nearly a decade, I think, to be able to give these protections to people who came to the US as undocumented children or lost documents, as me and my siblings did. And so, while for a lot of people this just came out of nowhere, parents like mine who had these children who were in this situation were watching that bill for so many years and praying and hoping that it would actually go through, like each time it was trying to get passed again. And they were just waiting on that. They were just hoping that that could be a possibility, because the main issue there was that their children were going to grow up, and it's a lot different to be an undocumented child who can still legally go through K through 12 and do all those things, than to be an undocumented adult. So eventually there was enough waiting, and my oldest sister was about to turn 18, graduate high school, and my parents decided there was no more waiting to be done, and so we went back to Venezuela. And for years, I never knew how to really refer to this, because for me, at this point, I did feel like we were being forced. It was a very somber event. I remember everything around it to be very somber, very sad, and I would get kind of upset when people, even inside my family or outside, would be like, oh, but you chose to go back. You weren't, like, deported. And it just felt insulting or invalidating almost, because it's like, yes, technically it was our choice, but what other choice did we really have? I do feel like we weren't officially deported, but we were forced to leave. We were forced to self-deport, and it was for everyone, it was a very, very difficult time. But for me as well, again, I was a 10-year-old kid. I didn't speak Spanish. I didn't really know Venezuela, and above all, I was confused because my parents did not really finish explaining to me and making sure I understood what was going on. And so I, for a while, thought this was just like an extended vacation, and I couldn't understand the gravity of it. So I'm saying I remember everything very sad, very somber, very serious, but I feel like for a good at least few months, maybe a year, from 10 to 11, I was very much a child who didn't know what was going on. And at first that looked like being like, oh, I'm not really understanding the gravity of this. It's not a big deal. Like, I have this memory of the power being out when I was 10, maybe almost 11, soon after getting to Venezuela, and the power was out a lot at that point. Power outages every day of a few to several hours, which obviously was not fun, but hey, this is just temporary, right? Was what was going on in my mind. And I remember we did that. I was with my sister and my mom, and like an eyelash fell or something, so we did that thing where we press it together and make a wish. And I don't know who won, but like we separated, and my sister, who was a teenager at this point, and again super sad about this whole thing, was like, well, I guess it doesn't matter. I mean, we both probably wished for the same thing, right? And I just remember I was like, I wished for a puppy. And so, like, this just sticks out to me because, like, I had no idea what was going on. The house was so somber that, like, everything was so, like, deep right now, and I just still had no clue what was going on. And I think it's because, again, it wasn't really fully explained to me why we left, what we were doing here, what the fuck this new place is. And I do remember also asking, I was confused because I asked my parents, like, but we're gonna go back, right? To this only home I knew, the home that I left, that we just suddenly packed up and left, and I was like, we're gonna go back, right? Because there's no way we're staying here. But I guess there was a miscommunication there as well, because my parents, or my mom, they'd answer me being like, yeah, I mean, some point we could probably go back. Yeah, we'll go back at some point. And, looking back, clearly they didn't want to break my heart or whatever and say we could never go back. But they were also very much miscommunicating, because to them they may have meant like maybe someday we could immigrate again. And for me, that was like, okay, great, this is extended vacation. Like, I don't like that we're staying here so long, but like, we're gonna go back, right? So you said we're gonna go back. And it was just really hard for me to comprehend, because, imagine being this kid who just got ripped away from the only home you knew, and like going to this like place that is basically foreign to you, even though it's supposed to be your home country that you only lived there for a year before when you were a baby. And, it's a very confusing situation. And it got hostile as well, because the more time went on, the more I was like upset. Because I was like, why are we still here? When are we going back? When are we going back? Until my parents just finally like slapped at me. I was like, we're not going back. And it sort of sunk into me after that. And so again, I didn't know Spanish, which was already, a culture shock by itself, but the culture shock overall was very big. There's obviously a huge difference between where I grew up in suburban Tennessee and where I ended up being in Venezuela. There's different parts of Venezuela, but I'll just let you use your imagination. And what happened was, especially as I realized that this was for good, that I was actually not allowed back into what I thought was my home in the US, I grew very depressed. This was the onset of puberty, so it was a lot of things. I have this history in my family. I have other issues, but for me at the time, because it, the puberty and all this issue of like going back to Venezuela sort of coincided, and it all grew into these pretty bad mental health issues of severe social anxiety and depression. It all sort of mixed together, and I, for a long time, was just like, this ruined my life. Venezuela ruined my life. I hate this place. I hate being here, and the US is my real home, and I was taken from it, and, that was sort of my mentality. And when I say I went through some mental health issues, for example, with the severe social anxiety, especially as someone who didn't know Spanish, usually if a kid gets there at that age, they can learn pretty quickly just by immersion. Or at any age, immersion is basically the best way to learn a language. And I didn't end up, of course, learning how to understand what I didn't understand before, just from my parents only speaking Spanish to me, be able to follow along a class and do my tests or whatever. But I still wasn't able to speak it, and a lot of that had to do with the lack of practice because of social anxiety, and actually I became selectively mute for a while, usually around when I was speaking Spanish, especially when I was in school. The first time I can remember it happening, like the selective mutism being a thing, because I always, my entire life, even in the US, I suffered from some social anxiety, but it got really bad after I got to Venezuela, and it became straight up selective mutism. The first time I remember it happening is the very first night we got there. I was overwhelmed. I was in a packed van where my cousins and my uncles were picking us up from the airport, and they were super excited, and I was just like, what the fuck is going on? They asked me something, I'm assuming in Spanish, and my older sister next to me, translated, I assume, because I wasn't answering, and then I just kept not answering, and I just remember feeling this tightness in my throat, like I want to answer, I'm not trying to ignore you, but I can't say anything. And I don't know if it was just purely the Spanish, or maybe it was, even if I could have said it in English. I think maybe they did say, you can say it in English, but I just couldn't say anything. I felt this tightness in my throat, and that was the first time I remember feeling it. And my sister just said I was being a bitch, whatever, and I couldn't explain myself of why I wasn't responding. And this became a thing for a long time. I would just be able to talk to me, and I would not respond. I would just stare at them silently, whether I wanted to respond or not. I couldn't. In Venezuela at that age, a lot of the assignments in school are also just presentations. So, this went on for years, and like every year I thought, after summer vacation, we're like going back to school, and it's like, this time it's going to be different, we're going to reinvent ourselves. And then I would just sit in each of the classes, and a lot of them, the first day when they're giving the like syllabus, I guess is what you call it, of what is going to be like for that semester, what the grades are going to be based on. And every single one was a presentation, and I would just start crying because like I just failed, except the only way I really got past that was through pity grades, because I could not do presentations, I could not speak, I was mute. And I really did just pass because of pity grades, because what I would do with those presentations was just like, I would study all night, even though it was not apparent, because once I got up there I could not say anything. I would be silent, I would often just be crying, and it would just be the worst long stretch of time of my life. Everyone's just quiet until my teacher is finally like, yeah, just sit down, and gives me a pity grade. But it was pretty horrible thing to go through as a kid, especially when you want to talk. You obviously don't want to be like this, but you're being blamed for it. So that was one thing. And then another thing is, like, I'm sure that Venezuela has gone through a humanitarian crisis, one of the most severe ones of the modern history, especially through the 2010s, and has been under a dictatorship-based regime since I was born, actually, which is one of the reasons why my parents decided to leave in the first place, and that's also why they didn't want to go back at first immediately. Things got even worse. The crisis got even worse. And for the rest of my time in Venezuela, which was up until I was nearly 24 years old, so I spent most of my life there, and I was going through, humanitarian crisis with Venezuela. I was not in a in the worst position, but I was definitely privileged while I was there. But it's funny because I was talking to a friend from Germany, and she said something like, "Oh, and you grew up poor in Minnesota." And I was like, "No, no. The thing is, I didn't grow up poor in Minnesota. I grew up like middle class in Minnesota, ranging from like maybe lower middle class to higher middle class, depending on the year, and what our situation was." And it was like yeah, but your middle class in Minnesota was still worse than my poor in Germany, you know? And it's very true. I did go through a lot of scarcity. Like I said, the power outages every day for several hours at times, depending on the era. In 2019, I believe there was a national month-long power outage. It was very scary. A lot of protests, a lot of people died. It was different depending on the year that I was there. But, you know, I went through a lot of things in Venezuela. The most recent of, like, the years I last lived there were the lack of running water. I usually did not have running water in my home. It would come on for, like, 30 minutes, ideally every night, but usually it would be, like, every other night, or, you know, on worst times, like twice a week, 30 minutes to an hour of running water, where she would, you know, like, it'd be like, the water's coming in, so, like, it's a big chaos, and you're trying to fill all these fucking buckets, filling my home so we can have some sort of water to flush the toilets with, to wash ourselves with, and to take the opportunity to shower, to do the dishes, and do everything you need to use water for. There was medication shortages, and like I said, I suffered through mental health issues. So, you know, I've been on medication of different kinds since I was 14, 15. And in 2020, when I had been on a medication that was not found in Venezuela, and the only reason I was able to take it was because my family on the outside in Mexico and Spain would send it to me in Venezuela. Then 2020 happened, COVID happened, mail stuff got shut down, and I could not find that medication in Venezuela because of the scarcity, and I could not be sent it, so I just went through withdrawal of, if you suddenly go off your antidepressants, it's a very bad time. You can look up the symptoms. It was just 2 weeks of like feeling like I was gonna die, if you know what withdrawal symptoms are like. So that was one of the worst things I went through there. There's just so many things I could tell you about the things I went through in Venezuela. The constant lack of opportunity, the protests and the deaths that would happen there, that would break out. Just, it's not a good time. I feel like no matter how much I say, I could go on, but like, I think it's pretty obvious that it was not a great time to live in Venezuela in the past 20 years, and that is where I spent most of my life. So because I was brought to that country and it only got worse and worse, and, you know, I was rejecting Venezuela for a long time during my childhood, because it was like, oh, this isn't really my country, you know, like, I belonged in Tennessee, and I was like, the US, and, you know, Tennessee specifically, but just like the US, I was like holding on this pedestal, and I was like, that's what I really belong, you know, that was my home that I was ripped away from, and I thought it was so unfair. I talk about in the zine how, like, when I was playing Monopoly for like the American version, if I got like the property Tennessee, it didn't matter if I was broke and somebody else was offering me however many thousand for the Tennessee card, because the other two properties, I would be like, no, I don't want you to take Tennessee from me. So it was a very emotional, irrational thing. I mean, I don't want to call it irrational. Like, obviously I was a kid. I went through something terrible. But my attitude towards the US took like an evolving, and my attitude towards Venezuela throughout the years. You know, because at first it was like just bitter I couldn't return to the US, and then it was just like, I hate it here, I hate this country and what it's putting me through, the Venezuela. And so for a while, when I was like a young teenager, you could ask me, how can you immigrate to whatever XYZ developed country, you know, Australia, Canada, US, Mexico, any place in Europe, lots of Latin American countries too. I would know it all. I would know every way that you could, every possible avenue that you could immigrate to so many countries, because I would just be obsessed with it. Like, I need to get out of here. I felt trapped in this place, I guess because of also the circumstances of how I got there, and I was very much rejecting it. And I don't know exactly when the shift happened, but after some point, you know, as I was still learning more about what even happened to me, because it was never fully explained, I started to develop a resentment and a bitterness towards the US. Actually, I stopped being like that was my home and just being like, I was never welcome there. I'm just realizing I was was never welcome there. I thought it was my home, and like because of the system of the US, because of their immigration system, because of the injustices there, I was kicked out and I was never welcome. And I was angry about thinking about how I would be forced to say the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag every morning while I was there. And that whole time, I didn't even realize, I didn't know what a green card was. I didn't know what any of that meant. I didn't realize I didn't belong there. I was clueless when I was in the US. I have this memory of, I was in a mostly white class. It was suburban Tennessee. And my best friend at the time, also a white girl, was like telling jokes. And she told one about like, there's like a Chinese man and an American man and a Mexican man off on a boat and it's sinking. So they start throwing stuff off. And the Chinese man throws off the rice because there's too much of that in this country. And the Mexican man throws off the tortillas because there's too much of that in this country. And the American throws off the Mexican, throws him off the ship because there's too many of them in his country. And, my child friend, I don't know how old we were, 9 maybe, told me this. I don't know if she even understood it. I didn't understand it, but I burst out laughing because I was like, yeah, a joke. I didn't understand any of it. I didn't identify as an immigrant. And, throughout life when I was in Venezuela, I did learn to love my country. I learned to like Venezuela and being Venezuelan. And the thing is, it's weird for a lot of people that I have this sort of pride, this sort of nationalism in Venezuela. Not just because it's Venezuela, because it is a weird concept and being patriotic isn't always accepted in a lot of different countries. But I feel like I was forced into it. I had to become proud of my country and learn to love it to survive. I loved it because I had no choice. I loved it because that's, if it had been different circumstances, maybe I wouldn't have grown to cherish it, to feel any sort of way about it. But the roles quickly flipped and I became very bitter towards America and Americans and resentful of what it put me through. And of course I'm still resentful for what Venezuela put me through, with the situation there did, but it was a very weird switch. And by the time I was an adult, and I was still desperate to get out of there. Even if I did love my country, of course I wanted to get out. And I talked about this with a friend once, that I think it's just so bizarre, one of these things in Venezuelan society. With any developed country, like in the US and Canada and whatever European country, it is not a normal question. It's like, I don't want to say it's only in Venezuela, but in Venezuela, it is a normal question to just come up to a stranger, if you're making small talk and be like, yeah, so you thinking of leaving the country? Or like, how are you going to leave the country? You got any plans? And I feel like in a developed, normal country, even in the US, where like, I'm sure a lot of Americans, I know a lot of you want to leave and wish you could, don't like the country, but it's not in society. It's not, you have to understand how weird it is for a society to be like, that's a completely normal question. If you ask that to someone in a developed country, it's like, so when are you leaving the country? They're like, what do you mean? Like, why are you assuming I'm leaving the country? But in Venezuela, it's just a completely normal question because, like, of course you gotta leave. There's no opportunity here. There's no future here. I just feel like, yeah, even if there were people who would answer, no, I'm not gonna leave, I don't want to, or, whatever, or I don't have an opportunity, it would be not a bizarre question to ask. It's like a normal question, and I think that is bizarre to me. That is very crazy to live in a society like that. So I knew I wanted to leave, but I had accepted a long time ago that, like, it's not that easy. As a kid, I was like, maybe I can do this, maybe I can do that, maybe I can go, whether it was to the US or Australia or anywhere, like, I need to get out of here. But, like, you need money, you need usually to be an adult, and you need a lot of things I didn't have. So it still was an obsession, or at the very least a plan I had. But I do remember when I was 23, one night I had been out with my friend and I was saying goodbye, and she was like asking again, like, so what are you thinking about, like, when leaving the country? And I think for the first time ever, I told her, and I told someone, that, like, I don't know if I'm ready. I had been through a lot of things. In 2020, I had 2 suicide attempts, especially after going off my antidepressants. I'd been through so much. I was not in a great mental space, like, much better than previous years, but, like, I felt like I wasn't ready. And for the first time, I'm like, I'm not in a rush to leave. I think I might stay here a while longer because I don't feel ready. And I remember that specifically because the very next day, I, that was the night, and then went to sleep, woke up, had a bunch of messages from family and whatever, like, did you hear about this thing? And the Biden administration has just announced the humanitarian parole program for Venezuelans that would give them an avenue to go to immigrate to the US for 2 years. It was something that was just out of nowhere. My life just changed overnight. And again, I had just told a friend the previous day, I don't know if I'm ready to immigrate. And now it was like, okay, go. We have to go. Like, everyone's applying for this. We applied within 2 days, and it was just like, people were convincing me, and it was like, what is going on? And it was like not just because like I suddenly had to move and suddenly had to like get on this shit and immigrate, but it was specifically immigrate to the US, who I obviously had all these feelings towards. And by that point, I had given up on immigrating to it. And I did do a little bit of cope because I was so bitter towards it. I was like, if they didn't want me as an innocent child, they don't get to have me as a successful adult, I wouldn't want to immigrate there anyway. But it was a little cope because like there were a lot of things I didn't like about America at that point, but it's also because I knew I would never have the chance, or at least I thought I would never have the chance. It was very, very difficult to immigrate to the US as a Venezuelan. It was back then. So this humanitarian parole program that just suddenly happened was insane. It was just like, wow, this is an actual, you couldn't even get a tourist visa back then. You still can't. They're not even granting those to Venezuelans and to a lot of other nationalities. So I just figured I wouldn't be able to go back like ever until I had like a citizenship in another country. So this was insane. This was out of nowhere, and my life did change overnight, and I had to grapple with a lot of emotions because again, I had this resentment, and I was like, initially I was supposed to move back to the same place where I had grown up in suburban Tennessee, a different town, but like basically the same area, because that's where my siblings lived, and I needed a place to stay when I was there. Everything was moving so fast, and I was also like conflicted because I was like, I mean, obviously it was an amazing opportunity to be able to move to America, to move to the US, especially from Venezuela. That was like an insane opportunity. And the fact that I may have even been considering like, should I do this, is just, I would have been an idiot to not take this chance, no matter how bitter I was, no matter how difficult it was. I needed to take that chance. There's just no other way. And I did, and I was accepted. And within a few months after I had told that friend I'm not ready yet, I was moving to the US. The big thing I was conflicted about as well was going back to the same place where I had grown up in suburban Tennessee. Obviously, I needed a place to stay, and that's where my family was. But I was not looking forward to that for several reasons. One, because like obviously you don't want to feel like you're going backwards. You want this to be a new beginning, and going back to the same place where you grew up is obviously not going to help that. But also, Tennessee, I was not a driver. I'm still not a driver. I don't enjoy driving. It gives me a lot of anxiety, and obviously I would have to learn to drive in Tennessee. Did not like that idea. I really wanted to live a openly queer life with a lot of queer opportunities. I feel like suburban Tennessee was probably not the best place to do that. There was just a lot lacking in that plan. And a couple years before that, I had made a very close friend online through writing, who is now my partner. But at the time, he was just a friend, and he was living in New York City, and he said, you can move here. You can stay on my couch until you get on your feet, and then, I think New York City would be a much better option for you. And it was. I was so thrilled to move there. Hey, Editing Ellie here to add in a little something I forgot to include in this video, but you can read more about in the zine. So when I got to New York, I had to wait 4 months for my work permit, so I was not able to work in those first 4 months. And when I finally did get to work, my very first job in the US was working at a migrant shelter for incoming migrants, as NYC was a sanctuary city for migrants. So it was a very weird thing to be a Venezuelan immigrant working with other Venezuelan immigrants, but in like very, very different, they had crossed the border, they had crossed the Darien Desert. It was just like a backpack, and I was living pretty cozy queer life in New York. I talk about it more in the zine, but I wanted to mention it in this video because it was sort of a very intense thing to go through, and it solidified my interest in immigration, seeing all these migrants, what they were going through, the horrific things they were going through, and serving them and working with them during my time in that job. That also increased my interest in immigration and my identity as a migrant. So if you want to read more about that, I talk about it a little bit more in my zine. And I talk about this in the book too, that New York City was just my favorite home I've ever had. I've never felt so at home. I've never felt like it's so comfortable and natural as part of a community. Every single day, even like 2 years after, not just in the beginning, like when you have those tourist feelings, but like 2 years after, like every single day walking down the street, of just being like, I'm so happy to be here. I just love this place so much, and I don't know how to explain it, especially because I know there's a lot of like native New Yorkers and stuff who's like, nah, I hate the city, It's like, I sound like almost like a tourist saying like how much I love it, but it's like, I don't know how to explain it. There was just something about that city that I feel like I will never be able to find anywhere. I was enamored. It just felt like where I truly belong. So obviously I was very happy living there for 2 years. It was supposed to be 2 years because the humanitarian parole program, it was not new to Venezuelans. Humanitarian parole was a thing, and it was usually only accepted for specific programs for specific countries. Something like 6 months prior to the Venezuelan one being accepted, which later grew also into Cuba, Haiti, and another one, not Nicaragua, I think. 6 months before that, Ukraine, because of the war and everything, also got a humanitarian parole program in the US. It's supposed to be for 2 years, and then you're gone. You just basically have a permit to live legally and work there legally in the US for 2 years. It's basically what the humanitarian parole program was. But, there was hope that I could find a way to stabilize myself, to legalize myself by the end of those 2 years. And there was also hope that maybe I wouldn't have to, because they would just extend the program. Many times the program is extended. For example, the Ukrainian one, we had hope when that one got extended, very close to when mine was going to end, because hey, they're extending this one, but they did not extend the Venezuelan one. They did extend the Ukrainian one. I know they're going through war and everything, but also, let's be real, probably other things had to do with it. And after that, there's different avenues I was just searching for and pining for, because after that, I tried to prepare myself when I went there. It's just 2 years. I need to be prepared to leave in 2 years, but that's not how things work when you move to a place and you start making a new family, new friends, a new lifestyle. You're not just gonna be well, I knew it was only gonna be 2 years. There's always that hope that you're gonna find a way to be able to stay. For a long time, I thought that was gonna be marriage. Fake marriage. I tried to date, and not just because I wanted to date as soon as I got there, but because I was hoping to find an American citizen to fall in love with and get my citizenship through marriage. That did not end up working out. I considered fake marriage, but that is a whole legal thing that I did not want to put people at risk for. There was something called TPS, Temporary Protected Status, for Venezuelans that had been going on for a while, and it didn't help that Trump became president again, got elected president again, around the same time that I had to leave. Hey, Editing Ellie here to clarify that what I mean by this, when I mentioned TPS is another option for Venezuelans, that is something the Trump administration immediately started to strike down, not just for Venezuela, but for other countries that have had it, for Syria, Sudan or South Sudan, for Myanmar, a lot of places of whose citizens were benefiting from this, the protection to stay in the US, and all of that. A lot of those were just being struck down, including the Venezuelan one, when the Trump administration began again. So I had even less options now. My parole ended in February 2025. I waited basically till the last minute. I had a week left of still being legal until I would become undocumented, when I was, once again, forced to self-deport, forced to make the same decision my parents had to make years ago. And obviously it carried a lot of emotional weight when it's the second time you're losing your home, especially from this country. It's the second time you're being forced to do this, because I did want to stay. I literally had no other way. It was also prompted, me immigrating with my new family that I had made in New York. It was also prompted by, of course, what was going on with Trump and what is still going on now with the Trump administration, of the ICE agent raids, the funding to ICE, how difficult it has become to live your life as an immigrant, whether you're documented or not, but especially if you're undocumented, in the US. Like I said before, things ended well for me. I'm currently living in Spain. I was able to immigrate again. I did have to go back to Venezuela to get a visa for here, which is not a great experience, but I'm safe now. I'm very financially stable. I'm stable in general. I have a loving family, and a stable immigration status as well, going towards citizenship here in Spain. I did have a happy ending, but one, it does not mean that it was not so emotionally difficult to go through this, both as a child and this time, while also bringing up so many traumatic events from my childhood. It was one of the most emotionally difficult things I've ever had to go through, self-deporting, not once but twice. And I felt that bitterness towards the US return, and so of course it was very difficult to leave. And once again, I want to say, even if things ended well for me, that is not the reality for many people who are going through the plight of being a US immigrant right now, especially without documents. And so once again, this zine, I wanted to tell my story. I wanted to tell, I talk also in the end of the scene. My camera battery is running out, so I'm sort of rushing through this last part, but I talk about a lot in the end of the scene about my feelings towards the US, about how it has dominated so much of my life. Its rejection of me has like affected so much of my life trajectory and my emotions, and just it has had such a grip on me, that country, that this scene is basically like my closure. This is my goodbye. This is my saying like, fuck, I'm sorry. I'm done with you. I'm done with like the US having like my heart and the trajectory of my life in the palm of his hand. I'm glad to put it behind me. I'm still grieving my home, the home I thought I had as a kid. But the home I recently had in New York, I miss New York more than anything. Barcelona is great, but like, it's very, it's very difficult to be forced to leave your home in any circumstance, even if you end up somewhere also nice, even if you are very privileged. But yeah, I talk a little bit more about, you know, my feelings towards the US, in this scene and everything I went through. So if you want to read it, again, it's on my website, and I'm working on getting physical copies out. I will be updating this description of this video with more places that you can find it as they come out, more physical locations. And I feel like I've rushed through this video a lot, but it's emotional. It's a very, you know, this was a very emotional undertaking to do. You know, it was taking me so long. I wanted to do it more towards the release it more towards the 1 year anniversary of me self-deporting, which was back in February. But it took a little while longer, and makes sense because like it's hard to talk about. But I hope this is my closure. I hope it can inspire people to get involved with their community actions and donate if possible, and volunteer if possible, and just spread the word. Share this on your social, share it word of mouth with anyone you know of what's going on right now and how we can help the groups who are protecting immigrant rights and anti-ICE. I'm gonna put as well some of the groups I think you can donate to, and you can also look for something locally, what's going on in your local community who are doing this. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope this isn't something I talk about a lot because it's closure. That's my story. Bye bye.